Sigmund Freud and Amarjeet Sada, two names from entirely different worlds. One belongs to a psychologist who studied the human mind, the other to a child shaped by social reality. This isn't a story for quick conclusions, it's a slow unraveling. Every crime has a story that starts long before the act itself, before a hand moves, before a weapon is ever chosen. Something starts to shift inside the mind. This isn't a story about monsters, it's a story about how the human mind is built and what happens when that structure begins to crack. We like to think the mind is just one thing, one voice, one personality, but it's not. The mind is more like a conversation, and sometimes even a conflict, between our impulses, our logic, and our sense of right and wrong. When those parts work together, we call it sanity. When they don't, we call it chaos. Long before psychology had scans, statistics, or clinical language, Sigmund Freud tried to make sense of how our minds actually work. His early theories emerged from studying upper-class Victorian women who were diagnosed with what was then labeled hysteria, a term used by 19th century medicine to explain psychological distress it did not yet understand. While Freud's interpretations were heavily criticized, this model laid the groundwork for modern psychology. In his theory, he proposed different regions of the mind, not as physical places but as theoretical ideas used to explain behavior. The first one's it. Operating on the pleasure principle, emotions such as anger, fear, greed, and lust are fueled by it. It represents the instinctive part of the human mind. It seeks immediate pleasure and relief, and doesn't stop to think about consequences. It does not plan or think logically. It simply reacts to desires and impulses. Then there's the ego, the part that tries to keep things realistic. The ego represents the rational part of the human mind. It helps a person make sense of reality and act with awareness. The ego develops from the id in early childhood and is guided by the reality principle. That is, the ego tries to satisfy the id's desires in a way that are practical and socially acceptable. And finally, there's the superego. It works on the morality principle and represents the moral part of the human mind. It guides a person towards what is right and away from what is wrong. This part develops through parental influence, culture, and social rules. The superego acts as an inner voice of conscience, shaping a person's sense of guilt and morality. In a healthy mind, the id, ego, and superego work together in balance. Desires are controlled by reason, and actions are guided by morality. Each decision becomes a balance between impulse, logic, and ethics. What happens when desire learns that reason can be ignored and morality never answers back? Desire can start to overpower reason, and morality may stop guiding behavior. That imbalance is often where deviant behavior begins. Freud explained this through gratification and inhibition. Gratification drives a person to seek pleasure and satisfaction. Inhibition works as a mental brake, helping to control urges and consider consequences. When gratification overpowers inhibition, actions can become impulsive or harmful. Together, they form our internal rhythm, desire and restraint. When both exist, the mind holds itself together. Think of it like fire. In small amounts, fire cooks food. Too much and it burns the house down. Every rewarding experience, whether food, music, validation, or power, triggers dopamine release in the brain. This neurochemical signal marks the initial experiences as gratifying. When inhibitory control is insufficient, the reward system loses balance. Dopamine shifts from signaling pleasure to creating compulsion. The individual requires increasingly intense stimuli, stronger, faster, riskier, to achieve the same neurochemical response. This mechanism underlies addiction, and in its most dangerous form, it can evolve into violence. When inhibitory mechanisms are underdeveloped, when the superego feels immature, the id dominates behavior. The individual loses the capacity to differentiate between immediate desire and what is right. This pattern is observable not only in criminal conduct, but also in episodes of intense anger, or any situation where emotional drives override rational deliberation. From my reading of Freud's theory, modern life feels like a thin coat of paint over raw instinct. Break it and you find the animal underneath. Freud argued that childhood sets the foundation for the mind. This is when the ego develops self-control. This is when the superego begins to register empathy and moral understanding. And this is when the id learns limits. Every lesson a child receives, sharing, waiting, apologizing, is not a social courtesy, it's construction work, building walls that keep the id contained. But if that foundation cracks, if trauma, neglect, or isolation break it too early, the walls collapse inward. The development of the ego and superego can be impaired. the mind stays stuck in its most primitive form, impulsive, egocentric, unrestrained. This is where gratification turns dangerous. Because once someone learns that pain can also bring relief, once the act of hurting becomes its own reward, gratification no longer needs pleasure. The individual begins to derive satisfaction from exerting power or control, rather than from socially acceptable rewards. This pattern illustrates how early environmental deficits can structurally shape a mind toward antisocial or violent behavior. That idea is terrifying, because it means violence can feel good, and if no one teaches otherwise, it becomes a habit of the brain. So far, these are just theories, diagrams on paper, words in a classroom. But somewhere in the world, theory becomes flesh, and when that happens, it walks, talks, and sometimes kills. In 2007, in a small village in Bihar, India, a boy barely 8 years old would make the world psychologist stop and stare. Because what Freud proposed in theory, this child seemed to live in reality. His name is Amarjeet Sada, and his story forces us to look at the mind of a child through Freud's ancient lens and ask a question no one wants to ask. How early can darkness begin? Begusarai, a place where daily life revolves around agriculture and tight-knit community routines. Whereas often is the case, children play under limited supervision, learning social norms and moral behavior largely through observation rather than formal instruction. Among them, Amarjeet Sada, like any other child, engaged in typical play and interactions. But this boy was not like most children, and yet, at first glance, no one could have known. He was 7 years old, an age typically associated with early moral learning and social development. Yet, at this developmental stage, he becomes implicated in a series of tragic events. In this small village, over the course of 4 years, 3 infants lost their lives. His 8-month-old sister, his 9-month-old cousin, and an unrelated 6-month-old infant. This case positions him as one of the youngest known perpetrators of serial homicide, highlighting extreme deviations in impulse control and moral understanding at a remarkably early age. The youngest serial killer in history. And he was just a child. The first death initially went largely unnoticed. In rural villages, the environment is often harsh and infant mortality rates are high, making unexplained deaths less likely to raise immediate concern. Yet, recurring patterns eventually drew attention. By the time local authorities intervened, a disturbing sequence had already emerged. Reports describe that, as the child waited to be interviewed, he sat calmly, swinging his legs beneath the chair, and asked a staff member for biscuits. This ordinary nature of the act doesn't match with the gravity of the events, demonstrating a concerning dissociation between behavior and moral awareness for a child of his age. Officially, Amarjeet was not held legally accountable. At just 7 years old, he fell below the age threshold for criminal responsibility in India, which prevented formal charges from being filed. Instead, he was placed in a room at home in Mcgraw-Hill, an institution designed to provide education, supervision, and rehabilitation for children whose behavior had crossed legal and social boundaries. When police had asked why Amarjeet had done such a thing, he grinned and said he simply did not know. And this raises profound questions about early cognitive and moral development. How could a child so young engage in acts that bypassed empathy, inhibition, and moral reasoning? From a developmental psychology perspective, this prompts consideration of the interplay between neurological immaturity, environmental influences, and the formation of the child's moral framework. This is where Freud begins to make sense, not as accusation, not as judgment, but as an analytical lens. Because even in a child, even so young, the forces he described, id, ego, superego, are at play. And in Amarjeet, the balance had already begun to tilt, allowing instinctual drives to dominate behavior. When we examine a child like Amarjeet Sada, it is tempting to label him as evil or simply ask, why? Whereas Freud encourages a different approach to study the underlying architecture of the mind. According to psychoanalytic theory, primitive urges clash with internalized moral rules, each shaping behavior and tension. In children, especially, this balance is still forming. Impulses surge, conscience is weak, and reality can seem uncertain. But in Amarjeet, something more extreme occurred. The id dominated, the superego was underdeveloped, and the ego failed to mediate. In Amarjeet, his gratification did not come from ordinary rewards like toys or sweets, but from the psychological tension that was released through dominance and harm. The superego, which develops through socialization, family influence, and moral education, was noticeably weak. It lacked structure, no internalized rules, no emotional weight to restrain his actions. The typical mental pause, the ability to reflect before acting, was absent. Freud's theory does not exist in isolation. It interacts constantly with environmental conditions. In environments where education is limited, parental supervision uneven, and hardship a regular part of life, a child's cognitive and moral development can take an uneven course. The child's mind, hungry for stimulation and reward, can adapt in dangerous ways. Over time, behaviors that provide immediate satisfaction, even harmful ones, can become reinforced. Repetition strengthens these neural circuits, making impulsive reactions more automatic and reducing the brain's capacity for restraint. Psychologists call this the gratification response, the brain linking actions to pleasure, relief, or control. In most children, it develops through play, praise, or affection. In Amarjeet, it was fulfilled through unspeakable acts, reinforcing darker impulses instead of positive ones. At 7, Amarjeet had already acted on these impulses multiple times, killing his sister, his cousin, and an unrelated infant. The repetition is key. Each act reinforced the dominance of his id. Each pause in action was brief, only long enough for tension to build. Neurologically, repeated experiences of gratification, whether positive or harmful, strengthen specific neural pathways. Each time the brain releases dopamine, it reinforces the behavior that triggered it. Gradually, the separation between desire and action becomes thinner. By 7, Amarjeet's id had become the dominant voice in his mind. At that point, Freud's theory of the id, ego, and superego stops being abstract psychology. It becomes a framework for understanding how disrupted development, environment, and neurological conditioning can combine to produce extreme and violent behavior. This raises an important question. Could intervention have changed the outcome? Could Amarjeet's moral framework have developed differently under more supportive conditions? In rural Bihar at the time, access to consistent education, psychological guidance, and awareness of developmental red flags was extremely limited. In such conditions, impulses could go largely unchecked and the id could dominate. This leads us to the broader perspective, the social environment that shapes cognition itself. The community, the access to learning, and the presence or absence of structure all influence how morality and self-control are built. To understand the forces that shaped Amarjeet Sada's mind, we need to zoom out. Beyond family and village, there is society itself, the schools, the books, the lessons, and the opportunities to learn right from wrong. Freud emphasized that the superego develops through interaction, guidance, and observation. Between 1998 and 2007, India made progress in literacy, but disparities remained. In 2001, Bihar had a literacy rate of 47.53%, with male literacy at 60.32% and female literacy at 33.57%. Rural areas lagged behind urban centers, and gender gaps were pronounced. These conditions limited moral and cognitive development, reinforcing Freud's theory that an underdeveloped superego can lead to unchecked impulses. Here, a natural question arises. If low literacy and limited supervision were widespread in Bihar, why did not all children exhibit such violent psychopathology? It's a bit like asking, if every child from an abusive household acted on their darkest impulses, how many parents would still be alive? The answer reminds us that environment alone cannot predict behavior. Something deeper must be at play. Not every child who grows up with limited support turns into a criminal, and this is where we must look beyond individual circumstances. The answer lies in resilience, protective adults, and cultural frameworks. Even a single supportive caregiver, traits like persistence and self-control, and traditions emphasizing non-violence can shield children from developing extreme behavior. Violence usually emerges from multiple risk factors: chronic abuse, neglect, or exploitation, not from poverty or poor schooling alone. Even in difficult environments, most children still experience some form of emotional feedback, social correction, and moral modeling. Small interventions that quietly shape the developing mind. These small but powerful influences shape the superego, guiding children to understand right from wrong and to pause before action on every impulse. When these guiding supports are weak or inconsistent, the delicate balance between id, ego, and superego can tip, leaving instinct and impulse more likely to dominate. In Amarjeet's case, however, these stabilizing forces were absent or inconsistent. After his initial acts of violence, the family's inaction, perhaps driven by disbelief, denial, or fear of social stigma, removed the possibility of early corrective intervention. Amarjeet's actions, while shocking, illustrate what can occur when the natural development of the mind's regulatory systems is disrupted. This is not a universal outcome of deprivation, but rather a tragic alignment of neglect, opportunity for repeated gratification, and absence of intervention. Observing his case through Freud's lens emphasizes that the architecture of the mind is constructed slowly, over time, through experience, instruction, and social learning. Literacy, education, and structured social environments are therefore not merely tools for academic or cultural development. They are essential for building restraint, empathy, and moral judgment. This is the intersection of individual psychology and social structure, where a child's mind, environment, and society collide. Amarjeet Sada's story is more than a tragedy. It exposes the gaps in the systems meant to guide children. But Amarjeet's case, as chilling as it sounds, isn't entirely alone. Across continents and decades, we find other children shaped by different cultures, yet scarred by the same forces: neglect, violence, control, or the absence of love. Each story reminds us that a child's mind doesn't grow in isolation. It mirrors the environment it's given. Gypsy Rose Blanchard, whose childhood was dominated by her mother's extreme control. D.D. Blanchard convinced Gypsy she was chronically ill, forcing unnecessary medications, treatments, and even making her use a wheelchair she did not need. This pattern could be termed as Munchausen by proxy, now more formally called factitious disorder imposed on another, FTIA, a condition in which a caregiver fabricates or exaggerates a child's illness to control them. Gypsy's mind grew in an environment where truth, autonomy, and natural learning were replaced by deception and enforced dependence. This constant manipulation limited Gypsy's ability to make decisions, learn from consequences, or understand right from wrong in normal ways. When Gypsy ultimately participated in her mother's murder, the act can suggest that it was less about innate aggression and more about the effects of prolonged control and chronic deprivation. Her case demonstrates a key principle in developmental psychology. Extreme environmental manipulation can profoundly shape a child's emerging sense of autonomy, behavior, and moral scaffolding. Going back to 1968 England, a young girl, Mary Bell, just 11 years old, strangled 2 young boys. The media labeled her a monster, yet her early life tells a far more complex story. Mary had endured years of sexual abuse, severe neglect, and exposure to violence, conditions that disrupted normal emotional and moral development long before she could understand basic safety or empathy. Psychiatrists later analyzed her and concluded that, although she did not suffer from a traditional mental illness, she displayed characteristics of psychopathic personality disorder. They observed that her social interactions were dominated by primitive coping strategies, including denial, manipulation, ingratiation, bullying, patterns formed as adaptive responses to extreme trauma rather than innate malice. Her behavior reflected survival mechanisms created under brutal early experiences. Different places, different times, but one shared pattern. These children weren't born with malice. They were molded by absence of guidance, of education, and of love. The brain, when left to raise itself, doesn't choose empathy by default. It learns from what it sees, feels, and fears. A picture of what happens when society forgets that a child's mind is both fragile and absorbing, like wet clay pressed by the shape of its surroundings. Before we judge the child, we must understand the soil that raised him. It is important to remember the cases we have explored, from Amarjeet to Mary Bell, are not tales of born evil. They are stories of neglect, of missing guidance, of moral frameworks never taught. But while we often talk about children losing their way, the truth is, many adults still do. The crimes that fill our headlines today are not the actions of the uneducated child, but of grown minds that once had every chance to learn empathy and restraint, and yet they too fail. That is perhaps the most sad part, that knowledge alone is not always enough. It must be understood, felt, and applied. Literacy can open the book, but conscience must decide what to read from it. Education must reach the corners that was once untouched. Initiatives to bring conversations about emotion, empathy, and safety into classrooms that once only taught arithmetic and grammar. Every time a child commits an act beyond our comprehension, or an adult breaking moral grounds despite knowing better, we are reminded of one thing: education and empathy must grow together. Only then can the next generation, wherever they are born, learn not just to survive, but to choose compassion over chaos.